Welcome to Dare to Innovate. Very excited for our session here today. I have two special guests with me, and our topic today is why does technology expense management matter in digital transformation? With us, I have Scott Gilbert, Calero's CEO. Welcome, Scott. And I have Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights. Welcome, Hyoun, and thank you so much for joining. Digital transformation, massive topic. It's one of my favorite ones. We can say AI, we can say IoT, and we can say digital transformations. They mean a lot of things. They also mean absolutely nothing. So looking forward to kind of digging into some of the details around that. But I want to start with a definition. And Hyoun, I'd love you to jump in here. I want to start with a definition of technology expense management and the acronym TEM. And I'd love to hear from your perspective because it's an old acronym that is changing. And so I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, just as a starting point, TEM has traditionally meant telecom expense management, an area that represented about $1 trillion in global spend. And it was difficult to to ignore this cost as a vital part of the business environment and as a gigantic portion of IT spend. Over the years, obviously, we have basically had flat telecom spend for about a decade now, honestly, where wireless spend keeps going up, wired spend goes down, and then in between, we see other areas change, such as cloud computing. So at this point, we're in a world where call it IT subscriptions, which includes telecom, network, and cloud computing, makes up about $1.7 trillion in global spend. But we have to start looking at this more holistically because we have all of this spend that has 1 year, 2 year, 3 year commitments, but nothing more than that. They're not necessarily pure assets. So we have to figure out how to manage these costs in contracts. So this idea of looking at technology expense management is increasingly important, and taking that technology term seriously in looking at cloud infrastructure, storage, network, compute, as well as traditional telecom network and wireless capabilities, and looking at that all together as a variety of OpEx spend that is a vital part of the digital operations of a company.
Yeah. And Hyoun, just to add on to that, increasingly for a lot of organizations, it's not just OpEx. Now that spend is coming up into COGS when you talk about IoT and the cost of delivering the services as well, even when they're not traditional service provider type organizations.
Right. Which pieces fit into what? It's not just apples and oranges, just very clear cut CapEx versus OpEx anymore. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the audience here, what is innovative about this, and why are we really talking about this? And obviously, we're going to go into more detail, but I really wanted to start with that definitionary piece because, again, to the majority of the audience out there, when they hear TEM, they think telecom, and it's obviously morphing and evolving. And I want to talk about some of that as we dive in. But really, if you think about the history of TEM in terms of pure telecom. And moving into these new things that are impacting the business, whether it be cloud compute, whether it be SaaS licenses, whether it be all the different things that are happening, it is a natural transition and it provides natural visibility because of the heritage that was out there. But it is about following the journey. Your digital transformation of how your environment and technology landscape is changing, you need to use tools to be able to manage that. And that's why we're really here talking about this today. So let's go back in time a little bit. And obviously, Scott, you and Hyoun has been in the space for a while, and talk about, what was the traditional role of telecom expense management, and then kind of why is it well positioned, or providers in that space well positioned to provide technology expense management. So Hyoun, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah. So as I said before, because telecom and network were traditionally such a big part of IT spend. We first had this very specialized tool that got increasingly complicated over time to manage telecom and network spend. And there's nothing wrong with that because the usage is extremely complicated when you get into call detail records and universal service order codes and all of the detailed aspects of telecom billing. It's where I cut my teeth. I love talking about the details of it. But at the same time, I also realize that at the end of the day, that's only one piece of what really matters today. I think part of the challenge is that over the past decade, IT has become increasingly subscription based, but the people who understand how to manage IT subscriptions best in an organization haven't necessarily learned all of the aspects of these new technologies. So it's easy to be in TEM and say, I understand TEM. I am managing my $25 million telecom budget. And then and then this little, $1 million cloud computing responsibility came in, and then that became 2 million, and became 4 million, it became 10 million, 20, 50, 100 million. Funny thing about it is that a lot of the strategies associated with managing cloud computing, such as the reserved instances or minimum annual commitments, or all of the issues associated with usage and access, are actually very similar to what we deal with in between cell phones and network and traditional telephony. But it's just a little bit of additional learning of how things like SaaS are actually managed and bought. That I think TEM managers are actually well equipped to manage, but haven't necessarily done yet because this thing popped up quickly. And over the last 5 to 10 years, it was sometimes easier to maintain a status quo rather than aggressively be a visionary within your organization.
So Scott, I'd love to hit on the last point that Hyoun made. Why do we think that TEM manager or that individual that's been managing this is well positioned to take that step forward in their organization and take on more responsibility?
Yeah, I think Hyun hit the nail on the head. The reason the TEM industry exists is because the costs that we're talking about are complex and recurring in nature, right? And so they need to be managed. And the reality is, not a lot of these organizations have a tremendous amount of deep expertise that get into the details that he was just talking about, whether it's USOCs or federal universal service fund fees, all of those complex things that are associated with TEM, allocations, and just all of those sort of the nitty gritty that we have developed over the years for telecom. Now we can begin to leverage that same technology. And I think that's the important part, the same technology to manage these other complex recurring technology expenses, which, sort of back to the origin, deregulation of the telecom industry was the origin of TEM. All of a sudden I have choices now. So I need to know which choice is the best choice. Are they doing it right? When you think about all these other services, you have that same set of factors. You've got a bunch of choices. You need to make the right choices, and then you need to hold those vendors accountable, right? And so the TEM buyer at the organization knows that playbook. They know that they need to go source it and quote it correctly. They need to validate the invoice. They need to charge it back and allocate it across the business. They need to manage the disputes. All of those things that are part of a TEM program in what we'll call traditional TEM apply now to IT subscriptions, cloud, all those other items that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think so. When you talk to, say, an experienced telecom expense manager, and you say something like, "Yes, I want to look at my costs, and I want to cross-charge them to cost centers and geographies, and split out exempt versus non-exempt, and governed versus ungoverned costs," like it's easy. It honestly, that is a part of the job that we have been dealing with for years. If you ask the exact same question for your SaaS portfolio, you'll get a lot of, deer in headlights faces very quickly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you ask the Salesforce.com administrator, hey, I need to allocate all my licenses across salespeople versus my operations people versus my client success. They're just going to be like, I don't know. I own it all. Charge it to me.
Right.
And how, who's using it, how are they using it, what's the trends based upon it. Yeah, I mean, all of that is typical for classic telecom and mobile expense management, but not typical when we talk about, these new things. So, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but to come back and think about the shift from telecom into technology, I think we've hit a few different pieces of it. But I thought you laid it out well. I mean, as you think about that shift, what were really the key drivers in obviously writing your paper and then a lot of the work that you've been doing? What are the key drivers that you've seen that is the natural move from telecom to technology?
Yeah, part of the reason, so we recently published our Telecom Expense Management Leaders Smart List at Amalgam Insights. And one of the major reasons we did it is we were looking at research that had been written in the past couple of years in this space. And we found that we felt like the reports we were reading, written in, say, 2023 or 2022, could have just as easily been written 10 years ago. There wasn't much visibility. There wasn't much of a focus on how the world had changed. And, it's not 2012 anymore. The iPhone is no longer the next, big thing. It is a big thing, but it's an established big thing at this point. And this entire thing called cloud computing has also taken over. Internet of Things have become much more established. Even things like data source subscriptions are starting to become a thing. With a combination of APIs and AI that are coming into play. So with all these different changes, we have to look at connectivity and telecom differently. And as honestly, telecom, the actual servers themselves are starting to go away, and telecom is becoming more of an app. All these things are happening. So in that viewpoint, simply looking at telecom expense the same way that we have 10 years ago really ignores how connectivity is actually affecting these newer technology capabilities. So on the one hand, it's very important to maintain good practices across invoice processing, payment processing, sourcing, procurement, all of these capabilities where traditional telecom expense has been good. But also bringing these capabilities and visibility out to the rest of the technology environment is also important. And to the extent that TEM has played and continues to play an important role in providing that visibility, we felt it was important to show both what was happening in the market today and to show vendors that were doing something different in this market to above and beyond what people are taking for granted.
Yeah, I think the piece that I continue to be optimistic about when we think about the industry and the value proposition is, you said it at the beginning. The CIO organization, maybe their wireline spend is coming down and wireless spend's going up and SaaS spend's doing this and IT spend's doing that. But there's still a lot of spend. And all of it is complex. It's not simple. It's not, if you go rewind 20 years and people were like, well, everyone's just going to buy an internet connection and everything's going to flow over top of that and you'll get one bill and it's going to be easy, and it's never going to happen. These are still continuing to be really complex expenses. And that's driven companies like Calero, like other TEM providers, to say, okay, we can't just manage the wireline and wireless. We've got to be able to start helping these leaders understand their cloud spend, their SaaS spend, their UCaaS spend. Obviously, during COVID, we saw UCaaS absolutely explode. And again, those invoices, those expenses, they're complex. You need visibility into it to manage it well.
I mean, I think all of this goes into the point of, when we talk about digital transformation at a broad topic, all of these go into, I think about it differently, because transformation, I think of a beginning and an end. when we think about IT and we think about what's going on, there is no beginning and end. It's just a beginning and then a continuous move. And these services, whether it was going from a PBX on site to Teams or Zoom or things like that hosted in the cloud, it's still to do a core job of me being able to call Hyoun and talk to you in a core way. Now, there's more services involved. There's more complexity involved into it, and the way that they do it. We need to continue to evolve with the space as we think about a TEM provider that's providing these solutions out. It's just an evolution of how things are shifting. It's shifting from a POTS line to an over the internet transition. We have to continue to move, and IT needs to continue to evolve, and we need to evolve with it and stay ahead of it.
Yeah, I think Hyoun, you said it, and Andrew was talking to my point about this visibility. I think you said it in your paper. Network management's not sexy, I believe was what you said in the paper, and a lot of people will say that, hey, this doesn't seem that sexy. I want to go talk about Chat GPT and all of these other things. And the reality is, because of the numbers we're talking about, like you said, $1.7 trillion. If you're not optimizing that, if you don't have visibility into that portion of it, you can't go invest in the sexy stuff. You can't go spend your time in this. And that's why it becomes more and more important as these spend levels increase, as the complexity continues. If you don't have the visibility into that, whether it's a traditional POTS line, or an instance on AWS, you got one spectrum all the way over to the other. You got to have visibility into it and a platform to manage it. Spreadsheets don't cut it.
And that visibility is really important, not just from a cost optimization perspective, because obviously you don't want to pay $100 a month for somebody who's calling like 8 minutes a month. And you can probably get by with $15 to $20 a month at the end of the day with some sort of pool. But more importantly, increasingly for the business, is also the behavioral aspects of how technology is used. So if you're on a call, are you also using your Salesforce or your HubSpot or whatever CRM you're using? What other recording technologies might you be using? Are you using a Chat GPT at the same time to help you with making answers, or a co-pilot, or what have you? I'm technology neutral at the end of the day, but just knowing, like, maybe when you're on this call, you're using 10 other technologies that are also important, or maybe best performers are using 10 technologies and others are only using 3, or maybe there's a specific 3 that are the create the magic to make people smarter. But you have to be able to look at these things in conjunction to understand what's going on, not just hey, I can see how many calls are being made or how much is each call, but also, oh, these people are making twice as many calls as these calls, or these people are taking twice as many calls. These people are able to answer these things faster because they're using this, that, and the other. These people log in more often to their other SaaS applications. And being able to see that in conjunction is increasingly important if you're trying to understand how your business actually works, rather than just talk about digital transformation, and just wave a wand over all of it.
There was a piece in the paper, and I think we talked about this a little bit, is about data. And data is ultimately king when it comes to it. And a lot of things that you just talked about, Hyoun, is the only way you get there is by being able to have rich data that is coming from multiple sources, enriched by multiple sources within that. What gives, a classic telecom provider potentially an advantage here when we think about what we've been doing historically and what we can do in the future? What are those things that we can contribute to give them that rich data?
I think one of the things that we take for granted in the telecom world is around call accounting. Age-old technology, decades and decades old, that provides a very specific and granular detail on how a phone system is used. And this is actually more specific than often the detail that exists associated with a single sign-on or SaaS logins or any sort of cloud usage or any sort of data usage. But we know how to use this data. We know how to align it to costs. These are mature practices. And I think the opportunity to bring this over, especially into the SaaS world, and say, you have 400 apps, you have 2,000 employees or 20,000 employees, you do all the permutations of what is possible on a day-to-day basis, and then figure out what is happening as a result. That kind of that traffic, the millions and millions of records that are created, that's just standard in the telecom world. And now we have the opportunity to make that also visible in the SaaS side, and then to be able to look at behavioral trends and managerial trends as a result.
It's a great point, Hyoun. We actually, I was just having a conversation with our CTO earlier this week. We were talking about a customer who we were doing SaaS license optimization for their Adobe. And Adobe only offered so much data in terms of the usage. It was much like a telecom carrier, whatever they had, whatever we could get. Call accounting, to your point, we would go directly into those PBXs and switches and be able to get it. And in this particular case, with that background knowledge, we went over to their Microsoft Defender, essentially their corporate firewall, and we were able to enrich that usage data and provide the same sort of, to your point, detailed analysis of how Adobe is being used, just like how these phone systems are being used, because of that background knowledge we had of doing it from 40 years ago, call accounting.
And it's kind of wild to think about how that age-old 1980s technology kind of mindset is actually still relevant, just for a different area today. But without that, you might simply go into your Adobe billing and say, this is all I've got, the end. Or your Microsoft 365 billing. These areas where, honestly, the software vendors are not doing a very good job of providing detailed billing information. And all you know is that you have to augment it, and you've got to be creative.
Right. I mean, yeah, they're providing as much as they want to get paid, but not so much that just like the telecom carriers did back in the day. It's just now we're not writing it in COBOL.
Well, I think that's been an interesting conversations with with the industry and talking to enterprises, and that has been that they need to start driving the vendors to give them the information that they need, just like we did with telecom providers or cellular providers going back 5, 10, 15 years ago, until we as an industry and, in partnership with enterprises out there, started pushing and saying, you got to give me more data. I mean, Adobe's only going to provide what the customer is asking for, and probably not completely what that is, until you have large enterprises starting to throw their weight around saying, guys, I need to be able to look at my environment in different ways to make different decisions. I need more information. You need to provide us more information. We need to start pushing, whether it be SaaS providers or cloud compute or any of these others, to say, we need more data for us to be able to run our business better.
Yeah, but I think there's going to be a bit of a difference in that with both telecom and cloud infrastructure. You have a few big players, whether you call them the ILX or the big three of Amazon, Microsoft, Google on the cloud side. Mabel. You had a few players who could actually drive billing standards to some extent. It's not perfect. Your AT&T bills.
Whether they were good standards or bad standards, they were standards.
Right. Exactly. But with SaaS, honestly, that's never going to happen. There's, 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 app vendors out there. They're not talking to each other about billing standards, and they're never going to. That's just honest truth. I don't expect Adobe, Microsoft, and Salesforce to suddenly decide in some enlightened way to provide greater detail for their billing information, which is actually great news for vendors like you, who have to, it's like guaranteed job security, having to make sense out of it.
Again, it goes back to the fact that these are going to continue to be complex Technology recurring expenses, right? That's, you opened it up talking about what's the definition of TEM, and we have lots of conversations with people that don't know anything about TEM, right? Have never been introduced, and probably the worst thing is that we just tried to keep the acronym the same and change the T from telecom to technology, and that's why I never use it. I'm going to say it's complex recurring technology expenses, and that people can wrap their head around that because they're like, oh yeah, I mean, I get my invoice from, Azure, and it's, you know, thousands of lines long and all of these different components, and that's not going to change.
I mean, part of the thing that gets me excited about the space or where the space is going is we are no longer reliant on an invoice when it comes to SaaS or when it comes to cloud compute. The invoice is something at the end of the day that happens, that's a bill that has to be paid. But what gets me excited as opposed to where we were at in the telecom or, in the mobile space is you have more modern infrastructure to deal with, meaning I can go out to these vendors, be a SaaS vendor or a cloud compute vendor, and pull in more real-time data. I can use leveraging modern APIs and structure to say, when that invoice comes in, I already know what it should be based upon all of the information I have, as opposed to the reactive world where we've been in telecom for years saying, I got the invoice now let me go back and figure out what actually happened. I can know what happened prior to anything being paid and optimize throughout the time frame.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the challenges there is that well, one of the good things about this actually is that APIs and services and modern infrastructure is taken for granted, whereas in telecom you are held to the lowest common denominator of the oldest switch that is associated with your environment. So having to maintain connectivity with something that's 40 years old and may not be able to even support half of what you're trying to do.
Yep. Yeah, as we were talking about that sort of the old technology, the new guard, you bring up a point. I know, Andrew, you're supposed to be asking the questions, but I'll go off script a little bit because you were chatting about it earlier, and it's a topic that I sometimes get frustrated with as well, which is how do these TEM administrators at enterprises, how do they get back to the CFO table or CIO table, right? I mean, these buyers, these administrators, these executives have an ability to probably drive a tremendous value. I mean, you talk about your IT rule of 30. How do they get back to the table? How do they get back on the, hey, this is not just about our fixed wireline spend anymore?
Yeah, so the IT rule of 30, in case you haven't heard it before, is just that the every unmanaged IT cost area averages 30% in waste if it's not managed correctly. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. Honestly, we analysts will come out with studies every couple of years that say, breathlessly say it's 27%, it's 32%. It's always around 30% at the end of the day. That's honest truth, and it has been for a long time. There's some variability depending on how new or how old a spend category is, but by and large, that number stays very consistent. But back to the actual question about how does a TEM manager get up to the CFO? I think this is something that has been a challenge that companies, that the people doing the TEM job don't necessarily know how to play politics well enough to raise something to an executive level. From my experience, when that meeting occurs, the CIO or the CFO involved in that discussion is almost always very interested in understanding how they have this $50 million expense that they can both optimize $10 to $15 million off of and get greater visibility into things such as a call center or sales activity or budgeting and planning and forecasting initiatives that they have, and even strategic planning. They are often surprised and awed by the amount of data that exists in the TEM world. But but TEM people, if you've been doing this 5, 10, 15 years, it's very easy to take this for granted, especially when the only person who talks to you on a daily basis about this is your immediate manager, who might be, call it an IT director, important in your company, but maybe a couple levels down from the strategic perspective of the company. So to some extent, I think there's some coaching necessary. I think TEM managers, people who are looking at these costs, these expenses, these contracts, this usage on a day-to-day basis, sometimes you have to be able to take a step back and say, this is important, not just say, this is important for whatever my job or my career, which is also important, but also for the company. Like there are other people in the company who will really care about this information if I share it. I think it's easy to trivialize the work you do on a day-to-day basis, especially since when nobody's giving you a pat on the back every day or every week for doing it. But this is actually an area where I think the data is important enough that there should be, if you're at a large enterprise, there should probably be 100 people who know what this TEM data is and how it can be used, because there's a lot of interesting behavioral and operational and usage-based information hiding in there, and cost unit basis of transactions and activities that you don't necessarily think about in TEM, but is very obvious to the rest of the line of business when they look at this data.
Yeah, Hyoun, I think you great answer. The one that I've used as well, and I think you touch on it in your paper, is as you start thinking about the new areas of spend that these managers, these organizations could invest in. And look, everyone would love to go to the CIO, the CFO, and say, look, we need to put $20 million into AI this year. And the CFO is going to say, there's not 20 million in the budget. And instead of just going with that, hey, we need to put 20 million, say, hey, look, we need to put this program in place. It's going to free up 20 million, right? We're going to be able to go free up 20 million that we can reinvest. And I think traditionally a lot of TEM managers operated a little bit out of fear that if they continue to escalate, their budget is just going to continue to get cut and cut. Now, these new technologies with cloud and AI, they can go and say, look, I'm going to show how we can reinvest the same dollar, budget neutral, and be spending a bunch of money on some really cool stuff.
I mean, like, that's the tricky secret, right? Like, you have to have some sort of project to replace the cost savings as well, or else you do lose budget. And honestly, a lot of managers are seen in terms of their budget and headcount as how important they are. If you can keep that budget in some way or maintain oversight over the budget and spending, that's obviously a stronger position. And TEM managers are actually in a good position to maintain oversight over AI spend, because at the end of the day, these are increasingly just other subscriptions that need to be managed in a very similar manner to telecom.
Yeah, you need to procure, you need to quote, you need to manage, you need to allocate, you need to audit, you need to do all of those basic principles that I think you kind of even spelled out in that paper, right? In terms of here's the core value props that you need to tick off.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit and kind of, bring us to a little bit ahead. One of the things in the paper is obviously you highlighted a bunch of vendors throughout that and kind of laid out some criteria. How are, one, when you think about choosing a vendor, as an enterprise is out there saying, hey, I need to go either find a new vendor for the new era, or I need to unmanaged spend that I've been managing on spreadsheets or not at all. What's your recommendation for beginning to choose a vendor within that space?
So there's a few basic problems that I typically run into with end user inquiries. The first is a company that has built it themselves. And I'll be honest, building an initial visibility capability for your top vendors actually is a doable practice if you have somebody who's smart in your organization and knows how to code and has prior telecom experience. But what always
release one is always easy.
Release one is actually not that difficult, all things considered. But what always happens? This person who is brilliant enough to build their own solution typically leaves after 2 or 3 years to move on to greener pastures or the next big challenge because they got bored and nobody knows how to maintain this. And then the carriers change all of their formats. And then, 5 years in, your tool is absolutely useless for doing anything other than being a spreadsheet. And that is changed over and over again. So I run into that problem pretty frequently. Second one is just net new companies trying to figure out. We suddenly figured out we had $3, $4, $5 million in this type of spend, and we need to manage it, and we don't even know where to start. But we do want to make sure we have a solution that is scalable, because we don't know how fast we're going to grow, but we've been growing pretty quickly so far. So we expect that growth will continue to some extent over the next 3 to 5 years. I also run into companies that have basically tried to use something like Coupa, some sort of expense management solution, and thinking we can just use Coupa or SAP or Oracle and use kind of their standard spend and expense management capabilities to manage this cost, but then realize that they don't have the level of detail that they thought they were going to have. This also happens with something like an Apptio with IT financial management, where you can see the size of the cost overall, but not at the level of detail that can help you actually optimize the cost or to assign the cost to anybody. So, these are the areas that come up most often. And at this point, we cover over 50 different telecom expense management, just telecom expense solutions at Amalgam Insights. We cover another 40 plus SaaS expense management solutions and another 40 plus cloud expense management or cloud FinOps solutions. So, there's honestly a lot of solutions out there, and often it comes down to how much the company wants to do themselves versus how much needs to be a service, and then digging into each of the specific areas of contract negotiations, spend management, usage management, invoice management, payment management, and kind of architectural visibility, and asking where you need help in each of these areas. Some companies really need help across all of these areas. They need, call it the full featured professional services and platform company. Some are looking for very specific niche capabilities because they either want to or have to do things in-house. Politics comes in for all sorts of reasons. I've yet to talk to a company that actually thought that telecom expense management or technology expense management was a core capability that they had to keep in-house for, operationally, but there's always politics that come up associated with some of these decisions as well. So those are a few things that come up most often during the initial inquiry process.
Yeah, I think buyer sophistication is a big one, right? And and the more that people get educated, and again, it's a big education factor. That the more that they see that, I think for me, the critical component is you do need a platform. You can't do this in spreadsheets. You can't do this internally as well as you will with a platform. And I think about, this mindset is certainly out in the sales world, right? No one says, "Hey, I'm just going to manage my funnel and pipeline through spreadsheets." That's an okay solution. No, they're going to put a platform in place, whichever platform that is. And it's the same with technology expense management. You need some sort of base system and platform giving you visibility, control, configuration, if you do want to take the program to the next level, whatever that next level is. To your point, is it digital transformation? Is it savings? Is it whatever it is?
Right. But at any technology that reaches multi-million-dollar levels of spend, you're going to have some sort of discounting. You're going to have your service level agreements, your KPIs. They have to be enforced over time on a monthly basis for each of those bills you have. You have to make sure your payments are going in according to schedule, and that they are also managed based on what's been contracted. All of this ends up being much more complicated than simply checking off a box and saying that you paid your bill each month. If you really want to take advantage of the power of spend that you should have as a big company with a significant amount of business with a vendor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott and Hyun, thank you guys so much for joining me. Very interesting topic around digital transformation, around how TEM has evolved from telecom expense management into technology. I think Scott, great point around complex recurring technology expenses. We continue to see more expenses come into it. Hyun, I know we did a podcast not that long ago together around SaaS and SaaS licenses. I want to have one final point and give you kudos. Analysts throw out lots of numbers. And most of them I'm kind of like, it's close. We talked about the 37%, the 27, it keeps moving around. But I finally saw, you being exactly right. We were in an enterprise, we were chatting about SaaS licenses, and we're like, okay, well, let's try managing a couple. And then all of a sudden, I didn't believe when they said it. I had to look at the data myself. They're like, yeah, now we want to load 220 more applications in here after we've loaded 10. I'm like, oh, all right, Hyun's right. I'm going to have to give him credit on the next podcast. But it was amazing. And again, large organization, 20,000 so employees, but it was really amazing to actually see how many applications they really have and how many they're actually using, how many duplication was there. But I had to give you credit live on a podcast that an analyst was dead on.
Wow. The analyst creed, we're often wrong, but never in doubt. So glad to see a counter to that for a change.
Hyun, thank you so much for joining. Scott, thanks so much for joining. Audience out there, I hope you enjoyed listening to this and watching this. Looking forward to see you guys on the next episode of Dare to Innovate.
Stay on top of the conversation. Like and subscribe to our channel to get notified when our newest episodes release. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Dare to Innovate.